So welcome to our final session this morning. To everyone, those online, I see you there. That looks like Ramsey Margolis. Is it?
Yes.
Hey, good late at night, New Zealand. What time is it, Ramsey?
It is now 2 minutes past 9 on Sunday evening.
See, he's ahead of us.
You see that?
In the future already. Well, so welcome, Ramsey, and anybody else who happens to be coming from the Antipodes. So this last session will be an attempt to pull some of these threads together. And I want to focus that around the idea of care. Care. And to bring to mind the last words of the Buddha, supposedly, before he died, as he was dying. He says, "Things fall apart, tread the path with care." Things fall apart, tread the path with care. That's my translation. There's many different ways you'll find this rendered. But effectively, he's acknowledging that we live in a precarious reality that is constantly breaking up and changing and disintegrating and renewing. And that is our life. And in such a context, in such a world, we need to tread the path with care. So care, in Pali, that's appamada, is clearly for the Buddha a very important idea. Yet, once again, it ain't on the roadmap. No mention of care. So why would that be? Now here I can give you a good explanation. Care is not one of the 32 factors, dimensions within this map that we're looking at, because care contains them all. And again, I'm not making that up. We find a sutta, I can't remember which one, in which the Buddha compares care to the footprint of the elephant's footprint. Now, what's distinctive about the elephant's footprint is that's the biggest kind of footprint you're ever going to get. And all the footprints of all the other animals in the forest can fit inside the footprint of the elephant. Again, something probably that would have been commonly observed amongst communities of people who spend a lot of time walking slowly in forests and trails and so on. Now, what does that imply? It implies that care is the overarching perspective in which this practice takes place. Care is the frame, the Gestell of this practice. We find another passage in the suttas where the Buddha says, all virtues are rooted in and come together in care. So again, this idea that it's somehow the virtue that includes all other virtues. Let's just think a little about care. Again, I'm inspired by Heidegger and his idea of Sorge in Sein und Zeit, which likewise he thinks of as the fundamental, I think he uses the word Befindlichkeit, the fundamental way we find ourselves in der Welt, in the world. And care, and again, this comes through perhaps more clearly in German than in English, implies an element of concern and worry. I remember seeing a political poster once in Hamburg that said, Ihre Sorge sind meine Sorge. And some dubious looking politician's picture in there. My concerns are your concerns. My cares are your cares. My worries are your worries, or your worries are my worries. So there's this element of concern, this element of care. And we already touched on that, although I didn't mention it too then, with Martin Hägglund's secular faith. Secular faith operates within the realm of care. I care for this world. I care for others. And in doing so, I suffer with them. I cannot care for somebody without taking on the suffering and the pain that they have. I can't worry about somebody unless I also feel that suffering that they have. There's a beautiful text in Shantideva at the end of chapter 6, where he says, if the Buddhas, the awake ones, identify with all beings, in other words, they empathize and identify with everything that lives, then how can they possibly experience joy? In other words, if you really do embrace the whole of life, then that means embracing suffering. It means caring about the fact that they suffer and seeking to live, constantly aware of that and living a life that is responsive to that. Now, care in this model begins with embracing life, number one, and it ends with responding to life situations. So when we, in our discussion yesterday about this picture somehow seeming to only focus on qualities that are quite individual and quite personal, we have to recall that this within a framework of care. So the relational dimension, I think, is given from the outset. And perhaps it would have been helpful if I'd stated that at the beginning rather than at the end. But thanks to the questions that came up, then I immediately began to think that that's maybe one way of addressing that issue. But I do think, again, embracing life is surely very much not a personal, individual thing at all. It's about reaching out to the world. And that's why I prefer embracing rather than comprehending or fully knowing, which again are too cognitive to my taste. And include, therefore, this embracing of life. It's not just saying yes to life or reaching out to life. It's also holding it in the way that one would hold something one loved. And there too, we can see that metta and karuna, love and compassion, are implicit in the very idea of embracing life itself. And we embrace life in such a way that also leads to the falling away of our own habitual reactivity. The being able to embrace life without reactivity, with love, with compassion, leads organically to a mind that's less and less driven by selfishness, by personal attachments and fears and so forth and so on, that then culminates in moments in which the reactivity dies down, maybe stops, and that opens us up to a new ground that we looked at yesterday, from which we can then respond to life in a way that's not determined by our own selfish agendas and our personal likes and dislikes. So in that sense too, we can see that the 32 dimensions begin and end with an engagement with the world. I do think it is true that in the history of Buddhism, that kind of got forgotten. And I think the Mahayana Buddhists who came along 500 or so years after the Buddha sought to correct that and brought back a much stronger emphasis on bodhicitta, a kind of altruistic motivation, as a way, I feel, to sort of readdress that imbalance. So the four tasks, I think, are embedded in relationship. Let me just give you a very we've been talking still very abstractly. Let me give you a very concrete example of how one might practice these four tasks. And I'd like to give the example of a therapist and her client. No, I'm not a therapist, but I am a meditation teacher, and I often meet people in a kind of counseling relationship, either during an interview, on a retreat, or I often have conversations with people nowadays by Skype who want to, who have some problem and they want to discuss it and so on. So what goes on there? Let's imagine that if this was a more traditional retreat, I would have a little interview room and people would knock on the door and then I would talk to them for, say, 15 minutes or so. So there's a knock on the door and I say, come in, and then there's a person, a human being, standing in the doorway. And I seek, I may not say this to myself, literally, but my first move is to embrace that person, not to get up and hug them. I might do that as well, but generally I don't on a meditation retreat. Maybe a complete stranger. But nonetheless, I try to render myself open and available and accepting of who this person is. That's the first task. And again, so it's a very specific way of dealing with our encounter with others, the world. The second task is letting go of reactivity. Now, it's not that I just embrace the reality of this person, but also I embrace the reality of my reactions to this person. And let's say it's someone I know. Let's say it's someone who I actually don't have a particularly good history with. Let's say it's somebody I find to be a bit of a problem. It happens sometimes. And so when the door opens, I hear my mind say, oh, not him again. Of course, I keep my nice Buddhist smile and that all looks fine. But I am aware of the fact that I've reacted. And I've reacted in a way that could actually get in the way of our counseling session. Because I've got a preconceived image, which is, if you think about it, what is that? It's a memory of a few isolated moments in that other person's life. They might have said something to me once that irritated me. They might have a manner that reminds me of an uncle I didn't particularly get on with. There could be any number of reasons why I react. But I'm aware of that now. And it's not that I want to suppress those reactions, but I need to take them on board. That's what's going to be part of this engagement. So I'm conscious of them, and in being conscious of them, I'm able to then just let them be. And since they're impermanent anyway, they will, over time at least, fade away by themselves. But by being conscious of those reactions, again, I'm allowing myself to be more available and more present for this person. The next step, and again, this is all going on within a few microseconds. This practice is one that we can think of as operating within in few seconds, or we could expand it to a few years, depending. It's not time determined. The next step in this is that, let's say the person comes into the room and sits down. I then try to settle into a non-reactive space. I think Freud actually had a very good expression for this. I can't remember it for the moment. But this space in which I tend to settle is one in which I don't hold, or I try not to hold any judgments about the person. I try not to kind of second guess what their problem is. I try not to be too concerned about how I've only got 15 minutes and then the next one's going to come. Once again, this stillness, this stopping, this openness is about availability, disponibilité, the capacity to be there for the other. And from that non-reactive space, I find myself saying something. The other person might introduce themselves or ask a question, or maybe not. It may just begin as a conversation that may come from my side. Who knows? Every case is different. But then I find myself responding to the person. And in doing so, on a good day, I'm sometimes surprised, if not amazed, by some of the things that come out of my mouth. I might even think to myself, where did that come from? In other words, this non-reactivity allows a spontaneity and a rapport to emerge that allows a deeper level of dialogue to unfold. I'm also aware, over the many years in which I've done this, that sometimes it works like that and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I feel like I'm a complete fraud. I'm doing my job as a meditation teacher, but my heart is not in it for whatever reason. Maybe I'm really tired. Maybe I've got some other problem in my life. And yet I still have to play my role. And I try to do it as best I can. But I know from what I'm saying that in some ways I'm not really connecting with that other person. I'm basically just mouthing Buddhist platitudes, saying all the right sounding things, but it's kind of hollow for me. It might be benefit to the other person, I have no idea. But in my own case, I can tell the difference between a response that's coming from somewhere deep within myself, a non-reactive space, and a response which is really just operating on automatic. I can do it. I know what to say. Maybe it's even helpful. But there's a qualitative difference in that rapport. So that's a very concrete example of how these four tasks can be channeled into a very concrete human interaction that's also part of my work. It's part of what I do for a living. It has to do with finding my voice, as we talked about here. All of these elements, are interwoven in this process. And I think it's helpful for us in whatever world we live in, whether we are, not everyone here is a therapist, though I'm sure some of you are. But in any situation in life, maybe with our kids or maybe with our colleagues at our work or the social events we go to, all of these can become places where this kind of approach can be applied. So this brings us, I think, back to Magda's question and to a question also that Peter brought up last night. How do I practice all of this? Well, I would start actually with reducing this roadmap to the minimum that we can imagine. And the minimum boils down to this acronym ELSA: embrace, let go, stop, act. That is a frame for practice. It's not a theory. It's a theory as well. but it is operative. In other words, it's a framework within which I can then, as it were, live and respond in this world to what's going on. And the example of the therapist and the client, or the meditation teacher and the interviewer, is just one concrete example of that. So it offers a kind of a frame. And I do use it that way. I bear that in mind. I'm mindful of Elsa. But I've been doing this for so long now, it's become kind of natural and integrated. But it gives us a sort of perspective or sensibility or frame for leading our lives. Now, that Elsa, which is the minimalist version of this whole project, can then be, as it were, amplified in every area according to what we have here. So E, embracing life, implies perhaps a certain vow to respond to the suffering of all beings. It calls for a greater and closer attention to my body, my feelings, my mental states. It implies coming to some kind of commitment and understanding of how I wish to live, what conditions I want to create in my life, in the world, to generate the kind of life and world that I aspire for. And it engages me creatively in terms of addressing my intuition and experimentation as to how to solve and respond to some of these issues. So the same can be done for the other four tasks. And if we think of what our practice is, then we can find practices in any of these areas. And particularly since we've introduced creativity into the process, this opens up the possibility of our of creative activities being thought of as the practice. So art, poetry, writing, these are just as much practices as meditation. And again, I feel it's quite important, and I think this model might help us, is to not reduce the concept of practice to what you do on your cushion. And this is a rather strong tendency amongst Buddhist type people, is they'll say, if you're staying with them overnight, they'll say, it's 9 o'clock now, I've got to go and do my practice. And usually that means they go off into a little room somewhere and they light a stick of incense and they meditate for 30 minutes, then they come back looking more radiant and serene. But the problem is that very expression, I think, betrays a problem, because you think of your practice as something you have to sort of stop doing what else you're doing and then you go and do your practice. And if you get Buddhists in a cafe together and they say, well, what's your practice? And someone, I practice Vipassana, whatever it might be. So we tend to think of practice as basically some kind of spiritual exercise that we do on a regular basis. And that is important, I feel, to have that sort of practice. But that's only one relatively small dimension of the practice of being human. And the practice of being human implies all of these things, all of these 32 things. It's true that numbers 2 and number 3 are very much turning inwards. And this is obviously very central to this process. It's not just a philosophy of life, but it's providing us with certain strategies that can help us actually transform our own inner experience. And this is considered to be rather essential, precisely because it's from within that we respond to the world. And it's in this Innerlichkeit, this inwardness of our lives, that I think we're able to touch into a deeper sense of our relationship to life as such. And in terms of the climate crisis and other crises that face us, I personally feel that unless there can be a real change in the way that we fundamentally relate to other people and to the natural world, I don't see much of an existential foundation on which we can then really, from the heart, embrace climate change, embrace extinction. I'm a great fan of Greta Thunberg, who I think is the canary in the coal mine. Do you understand that expression? The little bird they take down in coal mines in the old days that would be first to become aware of the poisonous gases, and it will faint, and then the miners can escape. I think you need someone like her to basically tell us the truth. And her message very much is, if we are actually going to, address this crisis, we have to live differently. It's as simple as that. We can't just carry on as normal. And I feel that not just Buddhism, but I think many of the world's spiritual traditions, in fact, I think, have an enormous responsibility in trying to effect that kind of change within, particularly, in order to engage with life from a very different perspective. One of the Western philosophers whose work I found quite interesting is Peter Slaughterdijk, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. You heard of Peter Slaughterdijk. He's a German philosopher. He's alive. He's a public intellectual in Germany, probably fairly controversial. And he wrote a book called, I think, Ihr müsst ihre Leben ändern.
Du musst dein Ändern leben.
Dein Leben
You have to
ändern.
live your change.
Oh no, it wasn't.
No.
Du musst dein Leben ändern.
No.
Ach ja, das bin ich fest. Ja, das bin ich sicher. Du musst dein Leben ändern. You must change your life. And not the sort of thing you expect philosophy professors to write. But Slaughterdijk, you see, used to be a sannyasin in India,
Yes.
right, with Rajneesh back in the 60s and 70s. And he's exposed himself to philosophical traditions in which actual practice is just part of it. It doesn't make sense to do philosophy if you don't actually take its lessons to heart and actually live differently. And that's, of course, the case with the Greek philosophers. It's the case with the Buddhist philosophers, Hindu, Taoist. And I think because we've lost touch with a living, practical philosophy, we've also, I think, lost touch with that sense of how the way we think and the way we live and work is rooted in, a different way of seeing and being in the world. So we can start with ELSA, these four things. We can expand our practice to include whatever else is going on here, and to think of practice, for example, as our work, as our imagination is a practice, to cultivate the imagination. Practice is very, very varied. And all of it is rooted in a primary sense of what we care for most. So I think I'll stop there.